Thank you very much. If there will remain time, we'll have a few questions at the end, I suggest. Before I invite Efraim come, I would like to tell you another story. I know that you like stories, I noticed it. At lunchtime, Professor Menashe approached me and told me, listen, your mission now is to promote the selling of the new book, edited by myself and by Liora Endelman Babur, who is sitting here. And listen well, he said, all the authors but one are my students. Now, when we came here, he told me the same, but instead of one, he said, all the authors, but two are my students. I said, how come that in 10 minutes you tell me once, but one, and secondly, but two? So he said, one of the two is myself. Okay? So this is the book, Iran, Anatomy of Revolution. And if you don't buy it, I'm not going to get a free copy. So the price is lower because of it. And I'm not going to say how much. Of course, it's commercial, and I'm not going to promote it. But this is the case. Okay, now seriously, Efraim Kam, Dr. Efraim Kam, achieved his doctorate in Harvard, and he's the deputy director of the INSS, the Institute for Security Studies at the Tel Aviv University. We know each other for a long time, and he's going to tell us, where is it? About Iran's national security concept since the revolution. Efraim, please.
With your permission, I want to use a PowerPoint presentation. And first of all, good afternoon, and thanks for the chairman. I want to start my presentation with a very brief comparison between the security problems of Iran and the security problems of Israel. Everybody knows here in this hall that Israel is preoccupied with severe security problems at all levels, at the level of terrorism and guerrilla warfare, at the level of conventional capabilities, at the level of non-conventional capabilities, at least part of it. In the future, if Iran gets nuclear weapons, we shall face also a nuclear threat. Iran has a different set of problems. Iran is not facing a threat to its existence, but it does face other kinds of problems. Some of them might be more severe than those that Israel is facing. Let me give you 3 examples. One is, Israel has fought 7 wars since 1948 until 3 years ago. And an endless number of military operations, small limited military operations. Iran was involved just in 1 war. The war between Iraq and Iran during the 80s, between 1980 and 1988, but what a war. Because during this war, Iran lost, according to the official Iranian numbers, 210,000 casualties. It is almost 10,000. It is almost 10 times than Israel's casualties during the last 70 or 80 years. One example. Second example, Israel's enemies are local or regional powers. Today it is Syria and Iran, and organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas. In the past it was also Egypt and Jordan. Iran enemies are superpowers. Iran's number one enemy today is the United States. In the past, it was the Soviet Union and Russia, and also regional power like Iraq. And try to think, what does it mean when your number one enemy is a superpower? How can you prepare yourself? What kind of measures you have to take in order to cope with such a kind of threat and enemy? And the third example, Afghanistan. Afghanistan cannot pose a real threat to Iran. The Afghani armed forces cannot cope with the Iranian armed forces. But Afghanistan is a different kind of problem from a security viewpoint. Because Afghanistan is the greatest producer of drugs around the world. And the path for smuggling these drugs from Afghanistan to Europe, to the Western world, go through Iran. And the Iranians are trying to stop this smuggling. And during the last 30 years, according to the numbers of the Iranian government, Iran lost 3,000 soldiers and policemen trying to stop this smuggling. We don't have this kind of problems, fortunately. So this is the kind of problems that Iran is facing. Now I want to move from here to the Iranian security concept. And I want to start by suggesting that during the last 30 years, since the revolution, the Iranian national security concept has underwent very significant changes. One, perhaps the most important source of these changes is the coming to power of the Iranian regime. A new regime with a different view of the world, with a different view of the role of Iran in the Muslim world, in the Middle East, with a different view of its relations with the powers, with other aspirations. And this new view is responsible for turning the United States from a very close ally into a number one enemy. It is also responsible for turning Israel as a strategic ally, regional ally, into an enemy. It is responsible for establishing or creating the Revolution Guards in parallel to the regular armed forces. An army by itself, sometimes even more important than the regular armed forces. For example, if Iran gets a bomb, the nuclear bomb, there is no doubt that the Revolution Guard, not the regular armed forces, will have the responsibility for using these weapons. The new regime is responsible for the fact that it changed dramatically the sources of arms, of rearmament of Iran. In this framework, they canceled a large number of arms deals immediately after the revolution, which denied Iran of significant amounts of arms during the war between Iraq and Iran. And finally, this new regime is responsible for the term, the Iranian threat. The Shah regime did create some kind of threat, especially toward Iraq, perhaps to a lesser extent toward the other regional powers. But the term, the Iranian threat, is linked directly to the new regime. It started, in fact, with the new regime. A threat which is directed against a large number of countries, against Israel, against a large number of Arab moderate regimes, against Western interests, against the United States. This is linked directly to the new regime. Secondly, and more, perhaps not less importantly, during the last 30 years, a large number of significant changes took place in Iran's what is called strategic neighborhood. In the first place, Iraq became a strong regional power during the late 70s, which threatened Iran directly. Then we have what I call the formative event, the war between Iraq and Iran. I think of all the factors which affect Iran's national security concept, this might be the most important one, for sure one of the most important ones. Because when the war between Iraq and Iran ended in the summer of 1988, Iran found itself inferior almost in all categories vis-à-vis the Iraqi forces. It had very limited operational air force, very limited armor corps, very limited ground forces, a very small arsenal of ballistic missiles. And while Iraq was much stronger and on its way to acquire nuclear weapons, if it was not stopped sometime later, with chemical weapons, with biological weapons, and Iran had no sources for buying arms around the world. It had no significant military industry. In one word, when the Iranians looked around, they told themselves, we are going to make any effort to make sure that this will not happen to us again, that we should not find ourselves in such inferiority vis-à-vis the Iraqis, vis-à-vis other enemies in this region. I think this explains to a large extent why Iran has been preoccupied with the nuclear program, with the ballistic missile program, with other aspects of military power. Then came the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is a major event for Iran, because it denied Iran of a major threat, which I'll speak about in a few minutes. And instead of having the Soviet Union and Russia as a threat, it became some kind, not as ally, but as a country with relatively friendly relations with Iran. Then came the two Gulf Wars, the one in 1991, and the other one in 2003. Iran was not part of these two wars, but Iran was affected by these two wars, because Iran did observe, perhaps for the first time so closely, what does it mean to have a sophisticated, advanced, modern army facing you. And it was impressed very much by the fact that a relatively small American army defeated the largest army, Arab army in the Middle East. I think this was one of the lessons that Iranians did learn from these two wars. And then came the intervention of the American forces, one in Afghanistan and Iraq, in which eventually the Iranians did learn the lesson. Because for them, the meaning was that the American administration decided to intervene and bring down two Muslim regimes in the neighborhood of Iran just because they crossed some red line from the viewpoint of the Americans. And the Iranians did learn the lesson. And they did take into account that they are going to face an American attack this way or another sometime in the future. I'll speak about that in a few minutes. So these are the most important changes in Iran's neighborhood, which did affect Iran's national security concept. This brings me to the next issue, the threat perception of the Iranian regime. We are accustomed to speak about the Iranian threat. I want to turn our view the other way around and to look at the threat from the Iranian viewpoint. When the Iranians are looking around, they tell themselves we are living in a very dangerous, unstable, violent, and threatening neighborhood. With a large number of wars, the last three major wars in the Middle East took place in this neighborhood. The war between Iraq and Iran and the two Gulf wars. It is an unstable area because of what happens in Iraq, what happens in Afghanistan, because there are American forces there, and Americans are intervening, and nobody knows to what extent they are going to be to intervene in the future in other countries in the Middle East. So for the Iranian viewpoint, this is a dangerous area. And part of the Iranian effort to build up their forces, to develop other kinds of weapons that they never had before, like ballistic missiles, and especially nuclear weapons, is explained by this view of Iran's neighborhood. I don't think that Iran believes that it does face a threat to its existence, perhaps like Israel. This is not the way the Iranians are looking at it. But on the other hand, they do think that these threats are a matter of concern, perhaps sometimes even major concern for themselves. And they have to take this seriously. And there is one more thing. If you go today to Iran and ask the Iranians, who is your number one enemy? For sure, the Iranians will say today, as I have said for the last 15 years, it is the United States. But if you would go to Iran, say 20 years ago, and you ask the Iranians the same question, and the answer will be different. They will say Iraq is our number one enemy, because this was more or less the end of the Iran war, traumatic, very traumatic war for the Iranians. And then if you go 10 years earlier and you ask the Iranians the same question, who is your number one enemy? 10 years earlier, it was the end of the Shah era. Then it was the Soviet Union, Russia. So the meaning is that within 30 years, within one generation, the order of priorities, the number one enemy has changed from Russia to Iraq, and then from Iraq to the United States. And this is not necessarily the end of the road. And this is not just an academic exercise, because the meaning is that you have to prepare a different set of measures, a different answer to deal with each of these three major threats. This is what Iranians are experiencing during the last generation since the revolution. I want to speak about the four major threats that Iranians are facing from their viewpoint. First, the Russian, if you want, in the past, the Soviet threat. For generations, for centuries, this was the most important threat from the Iranian viewpoint. It is historical kind of threat. Because when the Iranians are looking to the south, they see this giant Russia with aspirations to expand itself, with aspirations perhaps to go south in order to get approach to the warm waters in the Gulf. And the Iranians strongly believe that Russia would occupy parts of Iran if it could do so. And indeed, Russia during the 19th century did occupy parts of northern Iraq, and it did penetrate into Iran, into northern Iran twice in the former century and during the 20th century. And the Iranians did take into account that it could happen again to them. Now there is a change in this kind of threat, because during the last 20 years or so, the Soviet Union has collapsed. As of now, Iran has no common border. I don't know whether it was in the past in the history of Iran, but Iran has no longer a common border with Russia. And the relations between Russia and Iran became much more friendly. Not friendly perhaps, but more concrete. And Russia is an important factor in rearming Iran, in having in the Iranian nuclear program. Russia is important for Iran today. So this is one threat which changed dramatically. Second threat is Iraq. Again, Iraq is a historical threat from the Iranian viewpoint, which goes back to the biblical times. For the Iranians, Iraq is a spearhead of a hostile Arab world, of the Sunni world, though most of the Iraqis are not Sunnis, they are Shiites. But for Iran, they in a way, are considered as part of the Arab world, of course, because of a large number of border conflicts between the two parties, because they are quarreling for generations about the Shuttle Arab approach, and above all, of course, the war between Iraq and Iran. So for the Iranians, Iraq is was the number one enemy for some time, especially during the 80s and the early 90s. And then again, there is a change in that, because Iraq, since 1991, has been significantly weakened, and since 2003, Iraq is no longer a military player in this region. So for the time being, the Iranians are free of the Iraqi threat until sometime in the future, perhaps. Then there is the American threat. It is a new threat. It has never existed before the coming to power of this regime in Tehran. It is a new phenomenon. And this is a different kind of threat because the United States is far away from Iran. They call it the distant threat, unlike Iraq and Russia. Iraq and Russia will stay ever on the borders of Iran, or close to the borders of Iran, not the United States necessarily. And there is a chance that sometime in the future, the relations between these two powers, Iran and the United States, will change. The other way around, perhaps. But for the time being, since the early 90s, the United States has become the number one enemy of Iran. And it is an enemy because, in the first place, it's trying to contain Iran economically, politically, militarily. The Iranians believe that the United States will do its best in order to bring down the Islamic regime in Tehran. The United States is perceived by the Iranians as a spearhead of a violent or hostile Western world, as a pillar of the Western culture. And therefore, for them, it is a major threat. And above all, they have to take into account, especially during the last decade, and especially after America intervened in Afghanistan and Iraq, that the United States will carry out a military operation against Iran itself. When the Americans penetrated into Iraq in 2003, I think this was the peak of the Iranian concerns and fears of the United States. Then they took into account that the United States will carry out a military operation, large-scale military operation inside Iran. Since then, because of the American involvement in Iraq and the troubles they face there, this is not the essence of the Iranian threat. They don't believe or don't take into account so much that the Americans will carry out a large-scale operation against Iran. But they do take into account that sometime in the future, with ups and downs in their concerns, the United States will carry out a military operation against strategic sites in Iran, and especially the nuclear sites. And finally, there is another threat that I want to mention, which is the Israeli threat. It is not at the level of the former threats. It's not at the level of the Russian, Iraqi, or the American threats. It's different. It's much more limited. But the Iranians believe that Israel is not just a matter of concern, it's a matter of threat, because of two reasons. One reason is that they believe, and I would say rightfully so, that Israel is trying to encourage the United States to carry out military operation against Iran, to contain Iran. And I would say rightfully so, because every meeting between Israeli leaders and American leaders are focusing in part on Iran, how to stop Iran, how to contain Iran. And secondly, because they take into account, with ups and downs in their concerns, that Israel too might carry out a military operation, limited one, against the Iranian and nuclear sites. So this is the essence of the Iranian threat perception during the last 30 years. From this, I want to speak about the strategic aims of Iran. And I want to start by suggesting that about 10 years ago, in 1998 it was, the former Iranian Minister of Defense, Ali Shamkhani, defined the strategic aims of Iran. And he suggested 6 major aims. I want to put them on the screen. One was protecting the borders and sovereignty against external threat, then preventing strategic vacuum in Iran's neighborhood, then achieving strategic balance through self-reliance, then preventing regional arms race and encouraging regional cooperation. Fifth one was preventing external influence on the region's security problems. And the last one was active deterrence. I shall speak in a few minutes about 2 of these aims, about the self-reliance and about the deterrence. But the essence of all these 6 aims, especially the other 4 that I didn't mention, is they explain away why Iran is trying to achieve hegemony in the Middle East, especially in the Gulf area. And I want to make another 2 comments on that. One is the Iranian aim of achieving regional hegemony. This is not unique aim of the current regime. It was a traditional aim of the former Iranian regime, especially the Shah regime, who wanted very much to achieve hegemony in the Middle East and the Gulf area. But the Shah wanted to do it through very close cooperation with the United States, with other Western powers, especially Great Britain, while the current regime wants to achieve this hegemony against the United States. And this makes much of a difference. And again, the top priority from the Iranian viewpoint is given to the Gulf area. This is the most important part of the region from the Iranian viewpoint, because it is linked to the oil flow, because it is linked to the sources of some of the threats direct against Iran, because this is the most important part for Iran. And yet the Iranians are investing many efforts to expand their influence in other parts of the Middle East. And I think there is much truth in what was suggested formally in this conference, why the Egyptians and other moderate Arab forces are concerned about Iran. They are concerned, among other things, because Iran is trying to build strongholds in the Mediterranean, in Lebanon through Hezbollah, and even in the Gaza Strip through the Hamas rule in the Strip. So, but the focus again is a Gulf. Now, one has to say that Iran has no territorial claims, with one exception perhaps, which is Bahrain. From time to time, when the Bahrains are making the Iranians angry, they mention to the Bahrains that they were part of the Iranian state in the past. But this is an exception. They have no, and they emphasize it, they have no territorial claims to other states in the Middle East or in the other world. But what they want is to affect the main strategic developments in their neighborhood, to be part of these developing events, to minimize the influence of other powers, especially the American influence in this part of the board. This is the meaning of the Iranian attempt to achieve hegemony in the Middle East. And there is another end that I want to mention here, which is known as exporting the the Islamic revolution to other Muslim countries. It is a matter of concern to many countries. They believe that the meaning of exporting the revolution is Iranian intervening in their internal affairs, trying to change a Muslim regime. And therefore, it has been and still a matter of concern for these countries. There is a big question from their viewpoint to what extent Iran wants to use force in order to export the Iranian revolution. And sometimes they believe that Iran will be able to use force in order to do it. The Iranians emphasize usually they do not intend to use forces, just they want to educate the masses in order to accept or to be willing to accept the Iranian model of Islamic regime. But in any case, I think during the last 2 decades, the Iranian emphasis on exporting the revolution has declined significantly, in part because it was after the death of Khomeini, in part it was because they failed. In fact, they didn't manage to bring about any Islamic regime in Arab and Muslim states. And in part because they felt that they did make other Muslim countries much more anxious about the Iranian intentions. So in a way, this term has declined for some time. I won't speak about the Shiite axis because of lack of time. It was mentioned in former sessions. I want to move to another issue. Since I don't have too much time, I want to give up this part of my presentation. I want to move to the last part. What is the strategic answer that Iran is building based on what I said before? The Iranians believe, as a lesson from the Iraq-Iran war, that what is needed in order to achieve hegemony, to defend themselves, to deter their enemies, is to build a strong military power. And indeed, when the Iraq-Iran war ended, they planned to build a very large army with 300 aircraft, qualitative aircraft, with thousands of tanks and so on and so forth. In addition to a large number of ballistic missiles and rockets and so on and so forth. It didn't happen because the Iranians faced 2 major problems. One was lack of money. They did learn very quickly that they don't have enough money in order to develop conventional capabilities and also to build the nuclear program and the ballistic missile program. And therefore, they have to make a decision. And that decision was to put an emphasis on 2 programs. One was a rocket and ballistic missile program, and the other one was a nuclear program. This is the essence, this is the core of the Iranian national security concept for the last 20 years. And then, after they decided, they in a way neglected their conventional capabilities, which are now relatively weaker than they were before. They put the emphasis on these 2 programs. Self-reliance is a very important component, perhaps the most important component of the Iranian national security concept, because they believe, or they want, to do everything by themselves, not to rely on other partners, not to rely on the superpowers, not to rely on external flow of arms. They want to do everything by themselves. And therefore, they have expanded very significantly their military industry, and they are producing, in fact, almost everything, from tanks to aircraft to ballistic missiles to small submarines, so on and so forth. The quality is a different matter, because the quality is still relatively low, and had many failures in these programs. But they are making progress, and they are improving that. In the future, it might be much more significant military industry than it is now. So this is one element. The other element is deterrence. And the big question from the Iranian viewpoint was, how can one deter a superpower? And the Iranian answer was, we know that we are inferior toward the United States, toward Russia in the past. But we want to force the United States to know that it is going to pay a very heavy price if it's going to attack us, in terms of casualties, in terms of attacking American targets in the Middle East, in terms of attacking allies of the United States in the Middle East. So the emphasis of the deterrence, to make it clear to the United States that it's going to pay a very heavy price. And indeed, I think for the time being, it doesn't work, because the United States is hesitating very much to attack the Iranian nuclear sites. And the main reason, I think, perhaps, is the fear of the Iranian response. This is part of the Iranian deterrence. And there is another element which is linked to deterrence, which is asymmetric program, asymmetric conflict. I'm sorry for the spelling mistake there. The Iranians have developed this concept, which means, again, we know that we cannot fight the United States because they are superior. But we shall develop forces like small units, like guerrilla warfare, like digging tunnels under the ground. See what Hezbollah did in Lebanon during the last decade. This is Iranian thinking. In order to take advantage of those parts of our capabilities that are superior to the United States, to make the United States pay a price if it's going to attack us. And again, and finally, before I come to the last point, is a missile program. This is one of the two most important programs that the Iranians are developing. And for them, the meaning is threatening targets of the United States, of US allies in the Middle East, threatening even Europe by long-range ballistic missiles, threatening, of course, Israel. And this is the meaning is to threaten not only military units, but also the civilian population whenever it is needed. So this is one of the two cores. And unlike the nuclear program that the Iranians do not admit that they carry it out, the Iranians are emphasizing the missile program. And they say explicitly that if they are going to be attacked, especially by Israel or the United States, they are going to use their arsenal of ballistic missiles against their enemies. I want to make two short comments about the nuclear program, and I'll end by that. And I don't want to elaborate on that too much because I know it's going to be the matter of a further or later session during this conference. I want to refer to two questions. One, why Iran wants the nuclear weapons. I can suggest three reasons for that. One is deterrence and defense. The origin of the Iranian nuclear program was the war against Iran. When the Iranians learned that the Iraqis are developing their nuclear program and they are approaching that stage in which they will have nuclear weapons against Iran. And then by 1987 probably, they decided to develop their own nuclear weapons. So one reason was to deter Iran at the time. Now Iran is no longer a military player. The meaning is to deter the United States. And the Iranians believe that once they have nuclear weapons, it is the best weapon, the best vehicle to deter the United States from attacking Iran. I would add to that Israel too. Second reason is what I spoke before, the hegemony. The attempt to achieve hegemony in the Middle East. The Iranians believe that if they are going to have nuclear weapons, it will enhance the Iranian hegemony in the Middle East, in the Gulf area. And third, the Iranians believe also that if they are going to have nuclear weapons, it will strengthen the position of the regime enormously inside Iran. And they are very sensitive about the survival and the stability of this regime. So these, I think, are the three major reasons why they want nuclear weapons. And my last remark is, what will be the future Iranian nuclear policy if and when they get nuclear weapons? First of all, I want to emphasize, we don't have any indications. Nobody has any indications for the time being, because of a simple reason, because the Iranians deny any intention to acquire nuclear weapons, and therefore they don't supply any indications how they're going to behave once they get the bomb. And there are two major questions on this background that we have to think about. One is, where will Iran stop? And there are three scenarios for that. One is that Iran will produce enough fissile material, which will be enough for producing the first bomb, and then stop, and wait until further circumstances. Second scenario is that they will produce nuclear weapons, but they will not admit it. They will keep some kind of policy like Israel's one, without admitting that they have the weapons, in order to limit the pressures imposed on them. And third option is to admit and perhaps even carry out nuclear test in order to make it sure to everybody that they have the nuclear weapons. These are the three options. But the most important question is, will Iran use the bomb? If they're going to get the bomb. And Israel is the only country which is asking this question specifically, because the Americans and the Saudis and the Egyptians and the French are concerned very much about nuclear Iran. But none of them is asking itself this question, will Iran use the bomb against myself? Israel does ask this question. And my personal answer is that if Iran is going to act as a rational player, which has to be proved, Iran will not use the bomb. For three reasons. One is what I said before. I think that Iran wants the bomb in the first place for deterrence, not for offensive needs. Secondly, because Iran believes that Israel does have nuclear capabilities, and the meaning is that they have to take into account that attacking Israel with nuclear weapons will bring about an Israeli response in kind, which means an Israeli nuclear attack against Iran. The outcome will be millions of Iranians killed in Tehran, for example. And third reason is the relations between Israel and the United States. And the Iranians have to take into account, especially if the American administration will make it clear, absolutely clear, that if they attack Israel by nuclear weapons, they are going to be attacked with nuclear weapons by the United States. And again, the outcome will be millions of Iranians killed. For these three reasons, I believe that Iran logically will not use a bomb. But, and this is my last comment, we have to remember that this is just an assessment. An assessment, strategic assessment especially, can go wrong. And secondly, we don't have indications how really the Iranians are going to behave. And therefore we have to be careful, very careful, because the question is critical for the state of Israel. And third, even if I am right by suggesting that logically Iran will not use a bomb, we still have to take into account that because we don't have any communication, any dialogue with Iran, in such a nuclear neighborhood, when two nuclear powers don't speak to each other, nuclear deterioration can take place very easily. Thank you very much.